Joe Whitmore found the fourth horse at dawn, and his blood ran cold. It was killed just like the others, but the killer hadn't fed. 3 clean punctures in the neck, no torn flesh, no struggle. The massive body lay untouched in the morning frost, a valuable carcass left to rot in the sun. His wife, Cora, stood beside him, her breath a white cloud in the cold air. "Mountain lions don't waste meat," she whispered. "Not unless something's wrong with them." Joe ran a hand over the wounds. He'd ranched this land for 20 years. He knew predator attacks. This wasn't a hunt. This was a message. An hour later, Wilmer Knox arrived. The old hunter's face, already a roadmap of hard years, tightened the second he saw the horse. He knelt down, his movements slow, his eyes missing nothing. "Joe," he said, his voice quiet, "we need to talk. Away from here." As they walked back to the house, Joe saw the tremor in Wilmer's hands. It was a shake that had plagued the old man for years, ever since a hunting accident he never spoke about. Wilmer kept glancing toward the dark mouth of the canyon, where the morning shadows clung like a shroud. "This lion's behavior," Wilmer said, stopping at the fence line. "It's not normal." He pulled a worn leather journal from his vest. "I've tracked wounded animals before. Sometimes they kill but can't feed properly. Their jaw's broken or their teeth are gone." He flipped through pages of careful notes and sketches. "And those puncture marks, they match wounds I documented years ago, before I learned to be more careful in that canyon." The words hung in the air. This wasn't just a random predator. This was a specific animal, an animal Wilmer knew. Joe's stomach tightened. 4 horses in 2 weeks, his finest stock, destroyed. "What are we talking about, Wilmer?" The old hunter's finger traced a detailed drawing of a large male lion. "Injured, lost part of his jaw in a rock slide about 3 years back. Can't hunt deer or elk anymore. Too quick." He looked up, his eyes haunted. "But horses in a corral, they're easy targets. He's adapted." The realization hit Joe like a fist. This wasn't going to stop. A wounded predator that had learned to hunt his livestock would never move on. Every horse he owned was now a target for an animal that killed for a living it could no longer enjoy. Cora came out onto the porch, her face pale. She'd been listening. "There's something else," Wilmer said, closing his journal. "The tracks I found yesterday. They're heading deeper into the canyon. He's not just hunting anymore, Joe. He's making this his territory." That night, the screaming of horses ripped Joe from his sleep. He was out of bed in an instant, rifle in hand, but he was already too late. Thunder, his prized stallion, lay dead by the fence line. Same 3 puncture wounds in his neck. But this time it was different. The wooden fence rails were splintered. Deep, angry claw marks were gouged into the posts. The other horses were huddled in the far corner, their eyes wild with terror. This hadn't been a quick, silent kill. This was a frenzy. "He's getting bolder," Cora said, her voice tight with fear. "Coming right up to the house now." Joe knelt beside his stallion, his hands shaking with a rage so cold it burned. 5 horses, his entire future, bleeding out into the dirt. This lion wasn't just killing his animals. It was killing his dream. Wilmer arrived with the first light, his face grim. He studied the new tracks. "Deeper than before," he muttered. "He's favoring his right front paw now, getting more injured, more desperate." The old hunter followed the tracks to the corral gate. "And look at this." He pointed to a patch of disturbed earth. There were drops of blood in the dirt, but this blood wasn't from the horse. "He cut himself on the fence," Wilmer explained, "probably trying to drag Thunder away and couldn't manage it. That jaw injury, it's getting worse." Wilmer stood up, his expression darkening. "Joe, this animal is starving, and starving predators make mistakes." "What kind of mistakes?" "Dangerous ones," Wilmer said. "He'll start taking bigger risks, hunting in daylight, coming closer to people." He gestured toward the house where Cora stood watching them from the porch. "Wounded animals don't think clearly. They just react." Joe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The lion had already come within 50 yards of his home. If it got any more desperate— "We have to end this," Joe said, his voice like iron. "Today." Wilmer shook his head. "That canyon is a death trap, Joe. Narrow passages, dozens of caves. Perfect ambush country for a lion. He pointed toward the distant dark opening in the mountains. I learned that lesson the hard way. Then what do you suggest? We wait for him to come for us? Wilmer was silent for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper. There might be another way, but you're not going to like it. He opened his journal again, his trembling finger finding a page marked with a scrap of cloth. 3 years ago, he began, his eyes avoiding Joe's. When I first encountered this lion, I wounded it. Joe stared at him. That's how it lost part of its jaw, Wilmer confessed, the guilt of 3 years pouring out of him. It wasn't a rock slide. It was my shot. My shot went wide. Caught him in the face instead of the chest. The pieces clicked into place. The journal filled with obsessive maps and notes. The years spent tracking a single animal. The tremor in his hands. This wasn't just a hunt for Wilmer. It was a penance. Why didn't you go back and finish it? Joe asked. Wilmer held up his shaking hands. These started after I missed that shot. I can't trust myself with a rifle anymore. He closed the journal. But you, Joe, you're steady, patient. You can end what I started. This is insane, Cora said, stepping off the porch. You can't go in there. But Joe was looking at the blood trail. It was fresh. The lion was wounded, weakened. This was his best chance, his only chance. How long before those wounds heal? He asked Wilmer. 2, maybe 3 days. Then I'm going in. Joe, there's something else, Wilmer said, his voice tight. The reason my shot went wide? It wasn't just poor aim. That lion, it's smart. It watched me for hours. It was like it knew I was coming. A wounded, starving predator was one thing. An intelligent one was something else entirely. Promise me you won't do this alone, Cora pleaded, her hand on Joe's arm. He looked at his wife, at the fear in her eyes. Then he looked at the journal in Wilmer's trembling hands. I won't be alone, he said. I'll have his maps. But as he spoke, his gaze fell back to the blood trail, and what he saw made his blood freeze. The trail split. 2 separate paths, one leading into the canyon, the other circling back toward the house. Joe knelt in the dirt, his heart pounding. Wilmer, he said, his voice tight. Look at this. 2 distinct sets of tracks. One was large, the prints deep, heading straight for the canyon. The other set was smaller, lighter, and it circled back toward the eastern pasture. That's impossible, Wilmer whispered, frantically flipping through his journal. I've tracked this lion for 3 years. He's always been alone. But the evidence was right there. 2 lions. The blood drops on the second trail were different too. Darker, older, an old wound. A mated pair, Wilmer breathed, the color draining from his face. The male is injured. He can't hunt. So the female, she's been learning to target easy prey to feed them both. The full horror of the situation crashed down on Joe. While he'd been focused on the wounded male, a second healthy lion had been watching them, studying their routines, learning their weaknesses. The attacks hadn't been random. They'd been reconnaissance. Joe's eyes followed the smaller tracks. They led directly toward the part of the property where Cora hung the laundry, where she fed the chickens every morning, alone. We have to warn her, he said, scrambling to his feet. Too late, Wilmer said, his voice a choked whisper. Look, fresh tracks, leading from the chicken coop, straight to the house, made within the last hour. While they had been at the corral, the female had been at their home. Joe's blood turned to ice. Cora was inside preparing breakfast, unaware that she was being watched, that she was being hunted. They moved toward the house, silent as ghosts, rifles ready. The tracks were clear. They led right up to the back porch, to the kitchen window. There were deep claw marks gouged into the wooden railing, right where a lion would rest its paws to peer inside. Joe, Wilmer whispered, his voice shaking. These marks are still bleeding sap. This happened minutes ago. The lion had been here just moments before. Where was it now? A low, rumbling growl answered his question. It came from the shadows beneath the porch. Joe raised his rifle, but Wilmer grabbed the barrel. Not here! You'll hit Cora through the floor! Inside, they could hear her humming. Joe crept to the window. Cora, he called softly, fighting to keep his voice calm. I need you to walk to the front of the house. Now! The humming stopped. He saw her face appear at the window, her expression confused. Then her eyes widened as she saw their rifles. She moved, her footsteps soft on the floorboards above the hidden beast. The growling intensified. The lion knew it was trapped. She's cornered, Wilmer whispered. But that means she can't get out. This is our chance. Joe nodded. On my count, make a noise at the far end of the porch. Draw her attention. Wilmer moved into position. Joe steadied his rifle, aiming through a gap in the porch boards, his finger finding the trigger. 1, 2. The front door opened. Cora was safe. 3. Wilmer slammed a branch against a post. The lion's head snapped toward the sound. For one perfect, terrible second, Joe had a clear shot. He fired. The rifle's roar was followed by a scream that was part snarl, part something terrifyingly human. Then silence. After a long moment, Wilmer peered under the porch. She's down, he confirmed, but there was no relief in his voice. Joe, we need to check something. They dragged the body into the sunlight, and what they saw made Joe's stomach turn to lead. The female's teats were swollen with milk. Cubs, Wilmer said, his voice grim. Somewhere in that canyon, there are cubs waiting for their mother to return. Joe looked from the dead lioness to the dark mouth of the canyon. He hadn't ended the threat. He had just told the real monster where to find them. The rest of the morning was a blur of grim preparation. The male lion would be back. He would find his mate's scent all over the ranch, and he would know she wasn't coming home. And he would be grieving, starving, and hell-bent on revenge. These are the 3 most likely den sites, Wilmer said, spreading his maps across the kitchen table. His journal, once a record of guilt, was now their only hope. High enough to be safe from flash floods, close enough to water for the cubs. This is madness, Cora said, her voice tight with fear. Let the territorial authorities handle it. They're 3 days right away, Joe said, checking his rifle again. By then, that male will have come for us. I won't spend another night wondering if he's watching you through the windows. As the afternoon shadows began to stretch toward the canyon, Joe and Wilmer made their final preparations. Wilmer packed a small satchel with emergency supplies. My hands shake too much for shooting, he said, but they're steady enough for guiding. 2 men have a better chance than 1. Cora watched them from the porch, her face pale. Promise me you'll watch out for each other. Just before they left, Joe saw it. Fresh tracks in the soft earth near the corral. Large paw prints, leading from the canyon, circling the spot where the female had died, and then returning to the canyon. These weren't the confused wanderings of a grieving animal. These were the measured, calculating steps of a predator that had found exactly what it was looking for. Confirmation. The canyon was a maze of shadows and silence. Wilmer led the way, his knowledge of the terrain their only guide. Joe followed, his rifle a familiar weight, his senses on fire. The first den site was empty. The second, near a natural stone bridge, was not. They heard the faint, mewing cries of hungry cubs from a narrow cave opening. They took up positions, waiting for the male to return at sunset. As the light began to fail, they heard him. A low, constant whimpering sound from deeper in the canyon, the sound of an animal in chronic pain. When he finally appeared, Joe understood Wilmer's fear. The left side of the lion's face was a ruin of scar tissue, his jaw hanging at a sickening angle. His left eye was a milky blind orb. This wasn't just a wounded animal. It was a monster forged in agony. He circled the den, his one good eye scanning for threats. Then he disappeared into the cave. The cubs' cries intensified, then went silent. Joe and Wilmer waited, rifles ready. When the lion emerged again, both men froze. He was carrying one of the cubs in his damaged mouth. It was limp, dead. He laid it gently on the ground and went back inside. One by one, he brought out the other 3, all dead. He had been unable to feed them. His injuries, his grief, had left him powerless to save his own family. The male lion sat beside the small, still bodies of his cubs, raised his scarred head to the sky, and let out a sound of pure, heart-wrenching grief. A sound that was more human than animal. It was no longer a predator. It was a father mourning. Joe lowered his rifle. Wilmer did the same, tears streaming down his weathered face. 3 years, he whispered, his voice breaking. 3 years of this. The lion turned its one good eye toward them. There was no aggression in the look, only a profound shared understanding of loss. It didn't try to run. It simply sat there, waiting. Joe raised his rifle one last time. This wasn't a hunt. This was an act of mercy. He sighted on the magnificent broken creature's chest. "I understand," he whispered. "We both understand now." Wilmer placed a hand on his shoulder. "Make it clean." The shot echoed through the canyon. The lion collapsed without a sound. Its suffering, and Wilmer's, was finally over. They walked back to the ranch in a heavy, respectful silence. Cora was waiting on the porch. "It's over," Joe said, pulling her into his arms. "All of them." In the weeks that followed, a new peace settled over the ranch. Joe rebuilt his herd, but he was a different man. More patient, more understanding of the fragile line between life and death in this wild land. Wilmer's hand stopped shaking. He burned his journals and took up woodworking, his mind finally at rest. The canyon remained a quiet, empty place, a silent monument to the tragedy that had unfolded there. Sometimes when the wind blew just right, Joe would touch the small scar on his hand from that night and remember. He remembered the grief in a predator's eye and the hard-won peace that had been purchased not with victory, but with mercy. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale of courage and sacrifice. And don't forget to subscribe. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching.